Hello there, and thanks for joining me for another look back at Crash magazine, my favourite Spectrum magazine back from the 80s. What we've got here is issue 37 from February 1987, so what would have been the first issue of the year. Obviously magazine's always 1 month ahead, and this issue is quite special for me in that it is the first issue I received in the post, my first subscriber issue. I'd been getting Crash from my local newsagent for a couple of years, and I think for the latter year they'd been reserving it for me as well, but I finally was tempted by one of Crash's offers. I think I got a couple of free games with my subscription, obviously the magazine a bit cheaper as well, and delivered to your front door. So there you go, this was the first issue that winged its way into my house directly from Crash. As you can see, the front cover game is Top Gun, which was released by Ocean, which was quite a pleasant surprise to the Crash reviewers. This cover, I believe, is not by Ollie Fry. It doesn't look like his usual style. You won't be able to see it, but there's a name down in the bottom left-hand corner of Ian Craig. It's very lightly written in there, so very modest, Mr. Craig. But anyway, a bit unusual for Ollie not to do the cover, but I guess the great man had to have the odd break. So, a few details of what's inside here. Jetman, the interview, should be interesting. US Gold throw down the Gauntlet, the official conversion after, I think, 4 or 5 imitations of Gauntlet, which was, of course, this top-down scrolling arcade game, which famously in the arcades featured the ability for 4 people to play at once. So obviously it's getting an official release here, so let's be interested to see what that scores. So, on we go into the magazine. Advert for Bombjack 2, which wasn't quite as good as the original, but included the original with it, so if you didn't already have the first game, then that was quite a good deal. Contents page, Star Raiders 2, editorial by Graham Kidd, still editor of Crash. Notably in the first few lines, he says that judging by the majority of the reviews in this issue, the first of 1987 this year is going to be dominated by film tie-ins and licensed versions of arcade games. So very true words there, Graham, and I think you'll find the Spectrum market in general from now on is going to be dominated by those sort of games. Now, this is interesting. Crash introduced a new rating system. They had quite a clutch of old style ratings, and they decided to streamline it a bit. So a lot of the old ratings that they use, such as use of computer and keyboard play, were no longer really relevant, so they condensed it all down to these 6 ratings here, which I suppose are kind of the relevant ones: presentation, graphics, playability, addictive qualities, value for money, and overall. And they're at pains to point out that the overall score is not an average of the others, it's just an aggregate score that they decide to come up with themselves as reviewers. And also, for the first time, the reviewers' names, after much badgering from readers, the reviewers' names will be included within their reviews as well. So there we go, list of reviews and advertisers. The advert for Contact Sam Cruise, which is a very cool advert with the shadow of the man himself there. Crash, which was just news and tidbits from the industry. Hunter S. Minson's column Fear and Loathing, which, as I mentioned in my other video, was not one of my favourites. Here we have it's called Down in the Dungeon, but it's basically brief pen pals, I suppose not pen pals, pen pictures of the Crash reviewers. So you got Ben Stone there, Mike Skippy Dunn, minus his glasses, and Paul Sumner. So these are the young lads who are going to be reviewing most of the games, if not all of them. So here we go, straight away, Crash Smash Gauntlet. Gauntlet wasn't the most graphically complicated arcade games, and as a result it translated pretty well to the Specky. They just had to get the gameplay right, US Gold, and they did that. As you can see, the graphics are quite neat and smart. The game really suited it, and it was a really excellent game as well, Gauntlet. It didn't really have a great plot to it or anything like that, but it was especially 2 players, it was great fun, even on the Specky, and Crash gave it a very credible 92%. So, and as you can see, there's all the guys' names on the reviews, so you can see what each individual guy thinks. Next up, we've got the UK version of the adaptation of the film Aliens. Now, this was a great game. I think Crash underrated a little bit. They only gave it 84%. I'm not quite sure why they scored it so low, but it's basically a first-person shooter where you take control of 6 members of the team sent to the alien planet, or LV-426, to investigate what's going on and to get to the Queen at the centre of the complex and kill her. Very tough game, but very atmospheric. Great game to play. As you can see, when one of the aliens rushed up to you, he's rushing onto poor old Gorman there. You had to be quick to make sure you didn't lose a Marine. So Alien, 84%. There we have Top Gun. Now, Ocean had been struggling a little bit. They'd had a few hits at the end of 1986, such as Cobra and The Great Escape, but even at this stage they didn't have the best reputation, and Crash weren't really anticipating Top Gun for one reason or the other a great deal. So I don't know whether because it wasn't quite as bad as they were expecting, they overrated a little bit, in my opinion. They gave it 90%, and whilst it's quite a neat game in places, that's the opening screen. That's nothing to do with the game itself. That's just where your jets take off. And the vector graphics move very nicely. It was a very nice engine used to work it, designed by Mike Lamb, coder Mike Lamb. I think it was a very limited game. It was basically just a one-on-one dogfight. It was a good two-player game. It was one of the few Spectrum games that had split screen, but most Specky gamers played on their own, so to speak, and I don't think that really would have been a great advantage. So on its own, it was quite playing on your own. It was quite a limited game. So as I say, I think that Crash over scored that a little bit. I think probably around 70% would be a more accurate score. Interestingly, when I wrote an article for the game for Retro Gamer, the License to Thrill section, I interviewed coder Mike Lamb, and he kind of agreed with me. He didn't think it was his finest work, but there you go. It got a Crash Smash anyway. So don't knock a Crash Smash, Mike. Not Terra Cognita. That was a Codemasters game. This is Terra Cresta, which is one of many Imagine an Ocean games in this issue. Arcade conversion of the sequel to Moon Cresta, coded by Jonathan Joffa Smith. I didn't really like this game. It's not a bad shooter, I suppose, but it really cramps the gameplay into the corner of the screen. And as you can see, there's one of Jonathan Smith's motifs there, the ducks, for representing your lives. I suppose it wasn't bad. I'm being a bit harsh, but I think the score that Crash gave it, 81%, is about right. Maybe a couple of percent too many. But I really like the arcade game, but I didn't think it was the best arcade conversion by Joffa. Elevator Action, another arcade conversion, I believe. This one doesn't fare quite so well with just 72%. Never actually played that game. Arcade or the Specky game. It's a Knockout, which is obviously a game of the TV series. Not a game that I should imagine would excite too many Specky gamers back then, or indeed now. And it gets a rather withering 39% from Crash, who call it a rather poor multi-event game. Ocean would have done better to have applied some of the skills that lay behind the Daley Thompson games. Of course, they're very well admired, the Daley Thompson games. And another Ocean game, Donkey Kong, which also doesn't get a particularly good review, mainly because the main criticism is that although it's a competent conversion of the arcade game, of course the arcade game is very old. It's being 1987, I think it's like 5 or 6 years old, the arcade game. So 48% for Donkey Kong. Footballer of the Year, which I think is a bit underrated, because I think this is a great game where it's one of the first games where you take control of one footballer and sort of play his career out from Gremlin Graphics, and they gave it just 68%. Crash, calling it reasonably good, fun, but a little too easy. Well, unlike most Spectrum games that were too hard, of course. Subscription offer wasn't quite as good as the subscription offer that I took out, because I remember I got a couple of very decent Ocean games. This one's more like budget games as well, but there's a few good games here. Hive I've not heard of, but Druid was a good Gauntlet clone. Heartland was Crash Smashed. The Best of Beyond had 4 games on it, compilation, so you could get 4 games there, or you could choose, I think, 2 of these budget games. Thrust, Bomb Scare, Happiest Days of Your Life, Ollie and Liz are all Firebird games. So there's some decent games there, if nothing else. Super Cycle scores 63%. Cycling simulation, not really my cup of tea, but some might like it. Shailin's Road, another arcade conversion, this time by The Edge. Thought this one was actually underrated again, 67%. I thought it was a pretty good conversion, actually. It's a great arcade game, and I really enjoyed the Specky version, but Crash said it was a little bit disappointing. Yar Kung Fu 2, Yar Kung Fu, one of my favourite beat 'em ups on the Specky, but the sequel was a bit pants, unfortunately. Coded by someone called Julian Horn, according to this. Another Imagine game, and that gets just 48%, which I think might be overrated. Acrojet, US Gold, shoot 'em up stroke simulation. A couple of adverts for Durell games, Thanatos, where you control a huge dragon, I seem to remember. Trap by Alligator, which was coded by a nice chap called Rich Stevenson. I'm not sure if it's reviewed in this issue or not, but I remember it being a half-decent shooter. Lloyd's Forum, lots of debates, mainly about tie-ins and God knows what else. Nice graphics showing about the game, yep, loads of stuff about that. Lots of people worried about the 16-bit taking over from the Specky, which quite well founded, of course. So still lots of letters coming in. Crash Course. Now this was Rosetta McLeod was her name, and she did basically educational software. And I don't know how everyone else felt, but it was kind of usually the last section I read. I usually did read it, but it was one of the last sections I read. I wasn't really particularly interested in an educational software Fortnite Spectrum, even though that's the reason I managed to get my parents to buy me one. Adventure Trail, Derek Brewster. Still doing the Adventure Trail. I think he did it for a few more months after this before Off to Pastures New. We've got Bugsy, which was a St Bride's Adventure released by CRL, and Caliph, which was from US Gold. So still quite a few nice adventures being released. The Colour of Magic, obviously Piranha's adaptation from Delta 4 of the Terry Pratchett novel. And The Archers by Mosaic. I wrote about Mosaic for Retro Gamer recently, and The Archer was a really good game. They utilised the same method they did for Adrian Mole, Level 9, who were one of Mosaic's developers, and basically you had multiple choice, and they kind of turned you into a script writer for the show, and you had all these decisions to make, and they managed to inject quite a lot of humour into the game, which I think really helped endear it to Derek anyway. And finally, Dracula, which was the first game in the UK to receive a BBFC rating. It got a 15. They wanted to get an 18 CRL, but because the Spectrum version lacked animated graphics, the BBFC thought a 15 was justified. So quite a lot of gory screens in it still, but they were still on the Spectrum. They weren't animated, so just a 15, and it gets a pretty decent score from Derek as well, 89%. So, on we go. Sign stumps, help for people who can't work out how to play their adventure games. The Last Ninja, which was from System 3, which, as far as I recall, wasn't actually released on the Spectrum. I don't know what happened to it. I do remember speaking to Mark Cale, who was System 3 boss, a couple of years ago, might have been 3 years ago now, about another game he did, and I did ask him why The Last Ninja wasn't released on the Spectrum, and his reply was unprintable. Basically they didn't think the game was up to scratch on the Specky, but they did eventually release its sequel on the Spectrum, so they must have got it right in the meantime. Hannah Smith's playing tips. I think she was shortly off to Pastures New as well this year, so lots of playing tips, some lovely maps. Map for Iridium, great map for Firelord there, which is a Houston game. You needed a map for that game. Lots more stuff, tips and pokes. Let's have a look at the chart, shall we? This is the Hotline Top 30 chart. So this is compiled not from sales, but from the votes of Crash readers. So basically Crash readers would phone in and tell them their favourite games, and that's what would appear on the chart. In the earlier issue I looked at, Elite have 4 out of the top 5, and they're still doing pretty well here. Number 1 with Paperboy, which has swapped places with the previous number 1, Ghosts and Goblins, also by Elite. Light Force, which was a pretty impressive graphically shooter from Faster Than Light, which was an offshoot of Gargoyle Games, that was number 3. The Great Escape at number 4, and Uridium at number 5. So as you can tell, this is a pretty much classic era for Specky Gamings, because you've also got Commando, Elite, Matchday, Bombjack, Firelord, Dandare, Quasitron, Cobra. These are all big names, so this was obviously quite a big time for Specky games. And even some of the games lower down the list, such as Saboteur, Exploding Fist, and Bobby Bearing and Heavy on the Magic, they're still great games. Turbo Esprit there as well. So, and on the Adventure Top 30, Heavy on the Magic heads that one up. There you go, there's the charts. Drawing inspiration. This is an interview with John Richardson, the man who draws Lunar Jetman. Back issues, some results, always lots of competitions. Match Day Challenge. All these lucky lads took place in the Match Day Challenge to find out who was the king of Match Day. I think they played against the original coders as well. That chap there is Paul Johns, friend of mine, PSJ3089 I think is his handle on a lot of internet forums, and I interviewed him for an article I did on Eurogamer about Match Day and the Match Day Challenge. So they basically played, there's Paul playing against Chris Clark, who I think he designed the front end and did a bit of PR work for Match Day. So yeah, he's playing Chris Clark. I think he beat Chris Clark, and there he is playing one of his friends in the final playoff, but I think he lost to Steve Cartledge. I think there's a picture of him there. Yep, there's the winner there. But as you can see, the real winner is Mr. John Rittman, the coder of Match Day, who played 6 and won 6, as you might expect, I suppose. So some competitions. Techniche, skip past that. I don't think I ever read that much, unfortunately. Tech Tips from Simon Goodwin. Hall of Slime, bit of Lunar Jetman. Strategy games, Battle of Britain and Legions of Death. PBM, never been bothered to read that. The latest tomorrow night. And finally a clutch of reviews at the end. Xevious, which was another fairly ageing arcade game, which received a conversion from US Gold this time, and that gets 64%. Wasn't a bad game, I remember. Here's Hive, 78%. Looks like a tunnel shooter type game. Defcon from Quicksilver. Quicksilver still hanging on, but that only gets 45%. Cop Out, which was an early Raf Secco game, which I thought was really good actually, but Crash give it just 65%. Really great, nice, neat graphics as you might expect from him, but I think a bit limited and a bit unoriginal, which is why Crash downscored it. Hyperball from Telecom Soft, another mediocre game, which according to this tarnishes Odin's reputation. Odin was the developer behind it. Legend of Cage, we're back with Imagine now. This wasn't a bad adaptation, I thought, of the arcade game, but Crash gives it just 50%. And Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona. Like Football of the Year, which was a bit of an unusual football game in that you just took control of just one player. In this case, obviously the goalkeeper, as shots rained down from everywhere, but Crash didn't think it was much good, giving it just 42%. Imagine weren't having a good time with the sporting simulations at this point. Super Soccer gets 56%, despite some impressive sliding tackles, and is basically, in my opinion anyway, and certainly Crash's as well, nowhere near as good as Match Day or Match Day 2. And Konami's Golf just gets a couple of percent more, and to be honest is not up to leaderboard standard. And this one I think is probably overrated a little bit. Highlander gets just 57%, which I thought was a pretty dreadful game, so quite a generous score there. Impossible by Hewson, 89%. Agent X, great little budget game, gets 85%, well deserved that. Stephen Tatlock and John Tatlock actually wrote that. Double Take from Denton Designs, one of the last original Ocean games I think, and that gets 74%. Harvey Headbanger, a very decent little platform game from Firebird, one of their cheapy games, that was 80%. Ninja, which was good fun but not a great game, 50%. Another golf game. A few more budget games, all the budget games stuck at the end, as you might expect. BMX Simulator, Codemaster's first release on the Spectrum, and Howzat, which was a re-release by Alternative and got a very lowly 11%, but sold bucket loads apparently. And Hacker 2 and some previews. So there you go. Issue 37 of Crash from February 1987, just over 30 years ago. Thanks for watching, and I'll post another video soon. Cheers. Bye.